Who here is working on a project where users of the product, system, or service are actively involved in the design and development process? A few people. And user-centered design has been fantastically successful in creating so many of the wonderful products and services that we love and that we use every day, like connecting to the Wi-Fi. That was a really great experience this morning. Has everybody managed to get on the Wi-Fi? You can't hear? Sure. Sure. So, talking about user-centered design, and it seems like common sense that if you're designing a product or service, you want to get users of the product involved from as early as possible so that you can be confident that they're going to love what you're creating. And I'll play a video that summarizes how user-centered design is often approached.
Okay, Homer, pick out anyone you want.
Are you sure you want to give me a car?
Hey, you know what these things cost me? There's maybe $40 worth of steel in them.
Oh, okay. I'd like a big one then.
We don't have a big one.
Why not?
Because Americans don't want big cars.
Oh, then give me one with lots of pep.
Sorry, our cars don't have pep.
Why not?
Because Americans want good mileage, not pep.
Homer, tell the nice man what country you come from.
America.
Do you hear that, you morons? This is why we're getting killed in the marketplace. Instead of listening to what people want, you're telling them what they want. Homer, I need your help.
You do?
Yeah. I want you to help me design a car. A car for all the Homer Simpsons out there. And I want to pay you $200,000 a year.
And I want to let you.
Instead of listening to what people want, you're telling them what they want. And Homer's brother, Uncle Herb, was quite right when he said this. But often companies do deliver products and services that nobody actually wants. And Herb was also right to be skeptical of his design team's level of empathy and understanding for the customers. And he was right to get his team to start actively involving users in the design and development process. But unfortunately, just because you do actively involve users doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be successful.
I want a horn here, here, and here. You can never find a horn when you're mad. And they should all play La Cucaracha. Sometimes the kids are in the back seat. They're hollering. They're making you nuts. There's got to be something you can do about that.
Maybe a built-in video game would keep them entertained?
You're fired. What is my brother paying you for?
What about a separate soundproof bubble dome for the kids with optional restraints and muzzles?
Bullseye! And another thing, when I get in the motor, I want people to think the world is coming to an end. Run, run, run!
Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the car designed for the average man. The Homer.
Any questions? What does this monstrosity cost?
Jerry, what's the sticker price?
$82,000. This monstrosity cost $82,000. What have I done? I mean, the zoo was fun, but I'm ruined.
Who else here has ever worked on a project that's gone something like this? So unfortunately, I've seen things like this happening in real life, with companies spending millions of pounds or dollars on monstrosities like this by failing to understand user-centered design and actively involve users in the right way. So I'm going to give an overview of what user-centered design is. We'll talk about some of the common hazards and things that often go wrong. And then we can talk about how to go about actively involving users in a positive way in order to take advantage of the benefits of user-centered design, which is proven to be the best approach to digital delivery that we have. Design is a design philosophy that seeks to place the end user at the center of the design process. And evidence has shown that user-centered design enhances effectiveness and efficiency, improves human well-being, user satisfaction, accessibility, and sustainability, and counteracts possible adverse effects of use on human health, safety, and performance. Now, UX designers often complain that stakeholders don't understand UX and don't understand user-centered design. But UX designers often struggle to explain exactly what UX is, and there's a common misconception that user experience and usability is about making things easy or user-friendly. And this completely devalues it, because if you were going to ask a senior stakeholder, so imagine going to someone like Mr. Burns and saying, right, do you want us to make this product that you're paying for easy? He'd probably say, yeah, okay, sure. But if you said, do you want us to deliver it now, or do you want us to take a little bit longer to make it easy? He'd probably say, no, just give me it now. We'll give the users a manual, we'll do some training. But if you said to him, do you want the product to work with the users so that they can achieve their goals? Then it would be a very different conversation, and user-centered design would be taken a lot more seriously. And another problem with user-centered design is that UX designers often get bogged down with individual activities rather than focusing on the overall outcome. So there's a story that during and after World War II on Melanesian islands, there were local people who got used to American Air Force planes coming in and bringing cargo, like canned food and manufactured clothing, medical supplies. And after the American Air Force left, they went back and tried to recreate what they'd seen happening in the past. So they built runways and control centers out of sticks, and they lit little fires alongside the runway, hoping that they'd get the same outcome. But of course it didn't work, and no planes actually landed. And this is often what happens with UX and with user-centered design. So companies will often bring users into a usability lab that's got a two-way mirror. They'll create nice-looking personas and user journeys, and they'll run focus groups with users, and they'll stick a lot of post-its on the walls. But these things aren't what make a product or service successful. And user-centered design is often sold as snake oil without much substance to it. So what I'd like to do in this talk is give everybody working on digital products the tools to be able to spot cargo cult user-centered design and confidence to challenge it if you ever see it happening. There's an international standard on user-centered design, which is the catchily named ISO 9241 Part 210, Human-Centered Design for Interactive Systems. And this was a major undertaking by a team of international experts over about 4 decades. And the previous version of the standard was called user-centered rather than human-centered. And they changed it to be called human-centered design, which is exactly the same thing. They just wanted to emphasize the point that stakeholders aren't just users that are affected. All the humans working on a project need to be considered in user-centered design. Now, the standard itself isn't a document that people on a team are going to be following day in, day out. It's not a delivery process. It's not like Agile. It's not like Scrum or Kanban. It's about integrating user-centered design activities in a way that's going to complement the existing system design approaches that already exist within the organization or team. And the standard's quite practical in the way it clearly defines things. And it's a shame that Homer's brother Unky Herb didn't know about this, because it would have helped him. He had very good intentions, and it would have given him some practical guidelines so that he could involve Homer and other average Americans effectively in the design process. So this is the original diagram straight from the standard showing the different activities. They're not necessarily in a linear order, but the activities are to plan the human-centered design process, understand and specify the context of use, specify the user requirements, produce design solutions to meet the user requirements, evaluate the designs against the requirements, and then keep iterating around until you get to the point where the design solution meets the user requirements. So this is high level enough that it can fit with whatever the existing business or delivery process is. But if people are going to say, we're doing user-centered design, then they need to be doing all these activities and doing them properly, not doing the cargo cult version. So I'll go through each of these activities one by one, give some examples of where I've seen it done well, and some examples of where I've seen it done badly, so that hopefully we won't end up in a situation like Unky Herb found himself with the big reveal of that monstrosity. So the first activity is planning the human-centered design process. And as the saying goes, planning is essential, but plans are useless. So a lot of people don't necessarily associate user experience design with planning. But a key part of user-centered design starts with taking a human-centered approach within the project team. And although user-centered design doesn't address all aspects of project management, it does address planning and management of user-centered activities. And in particular, it's the importance of breaking down silos within a multidisciplinary team. So bringing together the designers, the business analysts, engineers, and developers, and ensuring that these user-centered activities actually contribute positively towards the project and support the needs of the business in line with any technical constraints. People often think of plans as being restrictive, and that's because often plans are restrictive. I used to work for BAE Systems in the UK, and they're famous for building battleships and fighter planes. And a lot of the planes that they're building at the moment are based on designs that were finished in the 1990s and haven't changed at all in 20 years. They're still building them. So they really lock down a lot of their plans. But with modern approaches to digital delivery, we don't have to define exactly what the final solution is before we start building it. And this still leads to some confusion at the planning stage when it comes to planning user-centered activities. So to give an example, usually project teams know that it's a good idea to test a website before it goes live with actual users. But I worked on a big project for a website for the BBC in the UK. And their research team ran a lot of usability testing before the website went live, all across the UK. And by the time they'd finished the testing, done all the analysis, and come back with a nice report with some really insightful findings, the website had already gone live, and the project team had already been disbanded. They'd used up all the budget, and they were just into a maintenance phase. So they had all these really great recommendations and findings of big problems users were having, but they had no money left to actually fix them. And this sort of thing happens quite often, and it comes about just from a lack of understanding about how these user-centered activities contribute. So the point shouldn't be, we need to test it with users. The point should be, we need to improve the website, and one way to improve the website is to get user feedback so that we can then improve it. But this can only happen if these activities get integrated. Otherwise, it's just going to be wasted effort and wasted money. Another example was a project I worked on for the government in the UK. They were developing a system for the police force. And like all digital government projects in the UK, they had to demonstrate good user-centered design governance and show that they're following the Government Digital Services Manual, the GDS manual. And the GDS team has a lot of authority within government on digital projects, so they really have a lot of influence. And they wanted to see all these activities here happening. But this was a bit of a challenge for the project manager, and often this can end up becoming a bit of a tick box exercise that you're just trying to demonstrate, okay, yeah, we've done all these things. Because the project manager has deadlines and needs to ensure that the agile delivery is being successful. So my role as UX lead became twofold. So on the one hand, providing and delivering user interface specifications to keep everything moving and to be able to hit the milestones. But then separately, putting in place some longer term activities so that we could all demonstrate good governance and show that we were doing user-centered design properly. So things like the information architecture, you can't really do that based on a small subset of requirements for an MVP. You need to take a longer term approach. Same with some of these things like ethnographic research. Doesn't really fit into a sprint cycle in the way that they were used to. And it was interesting that actually the solution architect on this project was having exactly the same challenge with designing the data model. And I understand solution architecture about as well as the project manager, so not very well at all. But he became the biggest advocate of human-centered design because by explaining to the stakeholder and the project manager what needed to happen, they were able to make it happen. And human-centered design is about finding who the key stakeholders are and speaking their language so that they can understand what the activities are. And often it's useful to talk in terms of risk and how these activities reduce risk, and governance. So with getting the government digital services team involved to help explain a lot of these activities, we were able to bring the organization together. And on a multidisciplinary team, everybody appreciates the need for the product at the end of the day to work with the users in their context in order for them to achieve their goals. So user-centered design and user experience is a very good place to start in terms of building up a common language that everybody can understand and that everybody can follow. And it can bring the team together as we move on to these next phases of design and delivery after the planning stage. So the next step is to understand and specify the context of use. And at least Stanky Herb was able to state who his target user group was. So he said it's for the average American. But often this level of clarity is completely missing on digital projects. Or often there can just be assumptions that are different in different people's minds about who the users are and what the context is going to be. And it's been shown that delivering systems based on an inappropriate or incomplete understanding of user needs is one of the major sources of system failure. Often the true power of good design is understanding that we don't necessarily know enough about the users in the context at the start, and that we need to learn and to continue to learn. I worked on a project recently for BAE Systems, and they put sensors on a lot of the different components on these battleships. So every pump and every boiler, everything on the ship had a sensor that was giving information about the status of this particular sensor. So they hoped that with big data and artificial intelligence, they'd be able to start to build up a picture of the overall health of the ship or then a fleet of vessels. And this is really important because not only could they begin to predict if a particular component was likely to fail and then replace it before it failed, but perhaps more importantly, they could tell if a component wasn't going to fail. So rather than having to go and replace everything on a periodic cycle every few years like they'd always done, they could leave things that were perfectly good. And this was potentially even going to be even bigger savings for them. So they asked me to design an intuitive dashboard that was going to be really easy for everybody to use to be able to quickly get a view of the overall health of a vessel or of a fleet of vessels. So based on what we talked about so far, does anybody have any suggestions about how you might start approaching a challenge like this?
Discovery phase.
Yeah, a discovery phase, or beginning in whichever way you need to, with just specifying, being very clear who the users are and what the context is going to be. What's going to be the context where this dashboard is going to be used? And when I asked them this, they said, well, we're not too sure who the users are going to be. I mean, we want it to just be so easy that anybody could use it. So maybe a fleet manager who is responsible for a whole fleet of vessels, he might be the person who's going to use it. Or perhaps a ship superintendent who's in charge of an individual vessel. Perhaps she's going to be the best person for it. Or it might be a ship surveyor who goes on board the ship once or twice a year to do the surveying. Or maybe port authority who are responsible for all the ships coming in and out of an individual port. We want it to just be so easy that anybody could use it. So I said, right, it could be somebody who works in an office and never leaves dry land, or it could be somebody who's at sea most of the year, or maybe somebody who's in the dockside and doesn't have any internet connectivity. And they said, yes, spot on, that's exactly right. We want it to work for all these different people. So I said to them, You can't design something like this that's going to work for everybody. And even if you are taking an inclusive design approach, so for things like ATMs or cash machines, as they're called in the UK, that are designed for pretty much everybody, even then, not everybody can use an ATM. So if you want to be accessible, you provide an alternative. But if you're setting out to design something that's going to work and going to make everybody happy, you can be pretty sure that you're going to end up making nobody happy. So in this case, they needed to design different interfaces based on these different contexts, as you say, with the discovery phase and understanding who these people are and what the contexts are going to be. So in terms of how you go about specifying the users and the context, well, user-centered design doesn't say that there's one way that's always going to work for doing this. But usually, on a project like this, usually it should be some sort of a document so that it's clear and it's explicit and there's not too many assumptions. And UX teams often have a bit of a reputation for producing bullshit documentation that with more attention paid to style over substance. So often teams will make personas or user journeys that look really, really wonderful, but don't necessarily contribute in the most effective way to the delivery. And often they're done from a template or based on artifacts that have worked well in the past. And if there's any doubt about how these documents are going to actually contribute to the delivery, then it's probably the cargo cult version and not user-centered design. But personas can be very important, especially when you've got a project that's aimed at specialist users working on complex tasks in an interesting or unusual environment. And on this project, we created personas after we'd done a discovery phase speaking with users. And these personas were really useful as we went into the design phase because they let us test our design assumptions quite quickly with an external representation of the user. So we were able to say, okay, this design we're proposing, would Owen, our ship surveyor, be able to make use of this? Much more often than we were able to get real users in and actually test things. But they were also very useful as a communication tool across the program for non-designers. So at one point they brought in a new program manager who wasn't from a shipping background, but he was the highest paid person in the room, or the hippo as these people are often known. And he had some strong opinions about how this application should be used. So I'm not quite sure what film he'd watched, but he thought it would be used in some sort of a control center on a screen about the size of this, and he thought that was going to be the context. But from our research, we knew that that wasn't what actually happened. If anything, mobile access was much more important. But because he was the hippo, people in the organization were reluctant to challenge him. But when we explained the personas to him and showed that these had been done with real users, we hadn't just made them up, then he was happy that there was good governance in place, that we were taking into consideration the context of all the different customers, and that his customers were going to be happy with the designs that we were delivering. So they ended up being really useful as a communication tool to bring people together as a focal point. So we planned the human-centered design process, understood and specified the context of use. Next, we need to specify the user requirements. And this was where things started really going wrong for poor Unky Herb, because his team asked Homer to specify what features he wanted on this car. And this is quite a common problem that happens often on projects. So Homer said, I want a horn here, here, and here. You can never find a horn when you're mad. And this quote reminds me of the quote, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. That apparently Henry Ford never said this, but there's definitely some truth to this. And as we know, humans are incapable of introspecting on our own mental states. We think we know why we do things, but this is an illusion, and psychologists know that people make confident but false explanations of their own behavior, as well as inaccurate predictions of future behavior. And this can have a big impact when you're specifying user requirements. A project I worked on recently for a financial services fintech company And they were developing a portal with a single sign-on for customers working in finance to access different financial data products. And they commissioned a research agency to go out and do a whole bunch of interviews with customers about this new product that they were going to launch. And they were asking them how they'd want it to work and what kind of things they'd want to be able to do with it. And they came back and reported their findings from these interviews, and they said, okay, this is going to be a complicated proposition with a lot of information, and these different users have different priorities. What the customers really want is a customizable landing page so that they can go in and set it up themselves, tailor it to their individual needs, so that it's only going to display the most relevant information when they first land in the portal. And when I asked if they had any behavioral evidence to support this, they said, no, we don't, but we've asked people, and this is what they've all said. And we know from years of research that customization features of the type that they were recommending often end up going unused. And it is really great to know as much as possible about the current context and about the users. But that doesn't mean we make knee-jerk decisions based on what people say without any supporting behavioral evidence. And there were things that we could do to do quite a lot of tailoring based on the user's login without spending a lot of time on a customization set of features, which would have been quite a big change for this company. And so we do need to be careful making decisions based on comments like this. Has anybody else, apart from me, cancelled a gym membership already this year? Yeah. So often we say we're going to behave a certain way in the future, but when the time comes, we're too busy and we just want to get on and do the work that we need to do. And it's important to have an appreciation of this and an appreciation of research methods and procedures and how to analyze the findings in order to get to the truth. And usually observing what users do is the most effective approach. And it can be good to use a combination of methods as well. So a project I worked on for the National Health Service, the NHS, that was around patient identifiable data. And we involved a lot of NHS staff in different departments and went in and observed how they were working and then followed this up with some semi-structured interviews afterwards. And this combination of approaches was much more effective. But another thing we found was we carried out this research in line with ethical guidelines specified by the British Psychological Society. And we found that users and NHS staff were able to tell us a lot of problems they were facing to us as the UX team that they wouldn't necessarily have been able to raise internally to their managers due to a lot of organizational politics and pressure within this organization. And this can be another big benefit of user-centered design, is flushing out some of these organizational issues early by involving users at the requirements stage. And involving users can also help to get buy-in, because they're much more likely to support this initiative if they feel that they've actually been involved rather than having something forced on them from management, which is often the case. So we planned the human-centered design process, understood and specified the context of use, specified user requirements, and the next step is to produce design solutions to meet the user requirements. And Unky Hope was quite right to encourage his team to involve Homer in this process, but they were wrong to actually ask Homer to design it himself. An important part of user-centered design is to make use of design best practice for usability and accessibility, interaction design, information architecture, as well as involving users appropriately. And UX isn't just what is behind the glass screen. In user-centered design, the design addresses the whole experience. So a project for a specialist legal application, and initially they'd gone to a design agency to do all the design work. And this agency had already, when I arrived, they'd already done the design solutions and created the style guide. And the designs looked absolutely fantastic when they'd been printed out and stuck up on the wall. And they had a lot of wow factor that really got senior management excited, and they'd won a few design awards. But they'd they'd made very generous use of white space and padding. They had massive fonts and titles and headers, massive images throughout. And they'd taken quite a short-sighted decision not to comply with accessibility standards around color contrast. So they'd gone with something that looked really great, but didn't comply with accessibility. So they hadn't prioritized functionality, and they certainly hadn't involved users in the design stage. And when we eventually did come to start testing the application, it was immediately clear that the content density was all wrong. There was just far too much scrolling for these specialist users who are using this application day in, day out, and they need to get their job done. They don't want to be scrolling too much. And the wow factor soon wears off if you're using an application like this every day. So we had to go and develop a new style guide and do a lot of rework. But if they'd involved users at the start through the design process, then it would have been much better and cheaper, because inevitably the later you make these changes, the more expensive it's going to be. And the standards for accessibility are there to help designers. There's evidence that following accessibility standards like WCAG 2.0 makes products and services better for everybody. So a good example was on the BBC iPlayer, which is a TV on-demand service in the UK. And we did a lot of testing right at the very start with disabled users more than 10 years ago when they were first launching the iPlayer. And focused on, in particular, on usability for people with low vision and with cognitive impairments. And they still do have a very accessible interface with very, very high contrast and focus on making it as simple as possible. And this strong focus on accessibility and the early involvement of disabled users in particular was a big contributor to its success as a mainstream product. And users often find themselves temporarily or situationally disabled as well, especially if you're working in a high-stress working environment with a lot of distractions, or from things like direct sunlight or a lot of noise. So usability and accessibility standards, best practice, and involving users early, as well as considering business and technological constraints, are the keys to good design. So we planned the human-centered design process, understood and specified context of use, specified user requirements, produced design solutions to meet the user requirements. Now we need to evaluate the designs against the requirements. And this was the final nail in the coffin for Unky Herb, because he did no testing whatsoever before the big reveal of the monstrosity of a car. And often there is no testing, and this is a common reason for system failure. But even when user testing is done, it can often be done as a tick box activity rather than genuinely feeding back into design and delivery. Another important consideration is that it's very easy to bias user evaluations, either by asking leading questions or often due to conflict of interest within a project team. So, for example, a UX team might be testing their own designs, and they want to cover their own asses, or asses as we say over here. Or maybe there's a senior stakeholder unconsciously putting pressure on a research team to come up with findings that are going to make them look good. Or just generally desire of research teams to make their bosses happy. Or there can be just pressure to be self-serving in order to win more work, for example, if the findings come a certain way. But user evaluations are supposed to uncover problems, and we should celebrate problems that come out of user evaluations. If anything, we should be very disappointed or skeptical if users love the designs the first time that we're testing it. I worked on a big project for a major telecoms company in Europe, and they were getting ready for the General Data Protection Regulations, or GDPR, to come in. And they had a few years advance warning ahead of these regulations coming in. Because if you think about it, this is very important for mobile phone providers because of all the data they have. So they know your location, they know who you've been talking to, they know what websites you've looked at, they know what payments you make. They know if you've been bad or good, so be good for goodness sake. And so they wanted to get really well prepared. So they got a research agency to run a lot of focus groups all over Europe. So they went to Scandinavia, they went to France, Germany, Spain, Netherlands, the UK, and spoke to a lot of customers. But very quickly, there was bias that crept into this research. So for starters, they ran focus groups, which is completely the wrong methodology when you're talking about privacy, which is a very personal issue. In a focus group, you're asked to come in with a bunch of strangers, and there can be a lot of group pressure and conformity bias to say the right thing, especially when you're being watched through a two-way mirror and recorded, and if you've been paid to be there as well. So there was this. Then they were asked a lot of leading questions due to some conflict of interest about confirming a particular narrative that was going to lead to more funding being released if they could make a business case for developing a very big application to give users fine-grained control over their data for different purposes. So they set up the focus groups and they asked the question, imagine you got a message like this from your mobile phone provider. Imagine that you're a motor racing enthusiast and you've booked a holiday to Monte Carlo and you're in Monte Carlo and you get this message from your mobile phone provider offering you free tickets to the Monaco Grand Prix. Now, how would you feel about that? And sure enough, everybody said, that would be absolutely fantastic. I would be very, very happy if my mobile phone provider sent me a message like this. So they followed it up and they said, okay, in order to send you this message, they'd need to know that you were into motor racing. They'd need to know that you'd booked a holiday to Monte Carlo. They'd need to know your location. Would you be happy for them to use this data to give you something like this? To which everybody said, yes, that would be fair enough. And then they said, okay, does that mean you'd be happy to go in and give the mobile phone provider permission to use this data for different things other than just making your phone work? And they said, yes, I would be more than happy to do that. So they presented this back. And of course, the free Grand Prix tickets was a complete fantasy. But they said, hypothetically, your customers are more than happy to spend time setting up their preferences as long as there's something in it for them. So this company spent a lot of time and effort making a really over-engineered and complicated proposition that was going to give people this very fine-grained control. And the longer this went on, it was hard to overturn this initial research with subsequent valid research, partly just because of the scale of it. They'd taken a really long time setting this up, and they'd paid a lot of money to get these findings. They weren't going to let it go easily. But if it hadn't been for this, they'd have probably gone with something a lot more streamlined, at least initially, and they'd have probably set out to do something more realistic, less ambitious, that would have probably been a lot better for them, because this ended up going nowhere. So you need to be very wary of conflicts of interest with user evaluations, and always question whether there's any incentives to be self-serving in terms of results. And even if there aren't, it's still very easy for bias to creep in one way or another. And for this company, we suggested they should do short, smaller scale, but more frequent user evaluations. That would be much better for them as a client. But even with this sort of guerrilla testing approach, you still need to be wary of biases creeping in and still make sure that there's an appropriate level of control over the methodologies being used. So we planned the human-centered design process, understood and specified context of use, specified user requirements, produced design solutions to meet the requirements, and then evaluated the designs against the requirements. So we need to iterate at every stage. So we can iterate our original understanding of users and context of use, we can iterate user requirements, iterate design solutions, and iterate the way that we're going about doing evaluations. And the purpose of this iteration is to progressively eliminate uncertainty rather than going round in circles. So how do we avoid the Homer-Simpson car situation then? Well, being user-centered is definitely the right way to go, as long as it's not the cargo cult version of user-centered design. And so to summarize, we need to avoid different disciplines working in silos, but instead communicate how all the activities and outputs contribute to delivery. Instead of assuming we know who our users are, we need to specify the users in the context of use in the most lightweight way that's appropriate. Instead of just listening to the voice of the user, we need to try and get into the mind of the user. Rather than designing just what's behind the glass screen, we need to follow best practice and ensure the design addresses the whole experience. And then rather than letting corporate politics or egos bias research findings, we need to plan and execute user evaluations carefully and appropriately. And as humans working on digital projects, we all need to be involved in this process. And user-centered design can bring a program or an entire organization together collaboratively to solve big problems. And if we do all this, we can be confident that the solution will work and that the users will be delighted at the end of the day. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the time frame. How do you divide the time?
Yeah, so I think the key point is it needs to fit with whatever the time frame is for a project that's already there. So it really depends on the size of the project. And if it's a long-term project, then the user-centered activities need to be appropriately large in scale to be appropriate for that. But if it's something much quicker, this can happen very, very quickly. The key thing is to do something to actively involve users. And if the time frame is just too short, then there's times when you can't involve users. And that's fine, it just means that you're not being user-centered, so that people can't claim they are being user-centered when they're not actually involving users. Sure.
Do you find that focusing early on and putting a lot more time into the initial sort of understanding of the specifications of the context, putting a lot more time there cuts down, or whether you should spend sort of a little bit more time there, and then as you go through the iterations process, can you get bogged down in the early phase? I mean, or is that really where you want to put all your energy initially?
I think you're absolutely right that you can get bogged down in the early phase. And again, it does come down to the nature of the project. So what level of risk are people going to be confident with? But as you said, it's a trade-off between getting something designed early so that you can actually start testing something versus spending a lot of time making sure you've understood the context first before you start design. And really this depends on whether it's things like whether it's a new product or service being launched or whether it's an update to an existing product, how many competitors there are, things like this. But a lot of those cargo cult activities are the things that happen in this discovery phase. So you need to be careful that people don't get bogged down or spend too much time doing that. And if you can move into a stage where you can be fairly confident that you're designing something and then have an opportunity to test that before anything goes live, then that's going to be a good way to go. Yeah.
So one of the things I've found through my life is that that I have this personal thing about when I'm working with users, is users are lazy and self-interested, and these can often be at odds, right? I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but that is kind of like the design philosophy that I apply, especially when talking to lots of different people and they all have different things to say.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the things I do is what's the laziest way to get this thing done? And I've just found that that's a great tool in the process of getting through what people are saying they want.
I think it is. And I think often some user groups who are very highly trained, very specialized, get very offended if you say that they're lazy.
Right.
No, I'm used to having to work very hard to get this application to work. I know exactly what I'm doing, so it's fine to have all these steps. But even then, this is all brain power that people are using on an interface. And if you could design something that let them be lazy in that area, then they'd have more energy, more cognitive capacity left over to do the important things rather than fighting with the interface that's been designed.
Yeah, true.
Do you have any recommendations when you get into a situation where you kind of kick off a project with a client and they're like, oh, we've already done all this research, we know what everyone wants, we're good, let's move right into development?
Yeah, so maybe they do. And so it's useful to talk in terms of risk. So in that case, you could say, okay, that's fantastic that we've done that. So we've already done the understand and specify context of use phase. Now, how confident are you with that? And then you need to see, have users actively been involved in this process? Where's the evidence for that? And if there isn't evidence, then this is going to be a risk. But if they have done that, it's absolutely fine. You move on to the next stage, because there'll be opportunities to go back and iterate that. So in that example with the GDPR project, they'd done this piece of research that had been done. It was then, okay, are we going to be having the opportunity to go back and validate that at a later stage? And maybe they have done a lot of good research. Maybe they have involved users in the right way. But talking in terms of risk, and then also talking in terms of good governance, so being able to demonstrate, have we actually done this correctly? Have we actually involved real users, or did we just use people internal to the team who made some assumptions? And often there's some sort of a risk register to be able to flag these risks. So you can say, okay, that's fine, more than happy to proceed, but we'll raise it as a risk that I'm not confident that users have been involved in the. And then you can say, I'm happy to solve the solution. I'm happy to help you to involve users actively as we go through. But yeah, you don't need to hold anything up, because you can continue, and with the opportunity to go back later. Ryan.
That was really great. It's really interesting. It's got me thinking about a lot of things, and one of these things is actually like putting a plan like this or an understanding like this into action. And you mentioned a couple times how these understandings and these approaches need to be across teams.
Yeah.
They also need to go up so that there's buy-in from the top. And I guess to narrow my question down a lot, when you present this out into the world, is your perspective that these are understandings and tools that a UX team or design team, which I think is often forward-thinking when it comes to being user-centered, is this tools to help make a pitch to the project manager, for example? Are these things that really an effective project manager, she's the one who needs to learn these? The UX team already has it, and this is really a pitch. An effective project manager needs to understand these, or is it more, I don't know, it could be something, a fourth option, but my third thinking was just sort of a general understanding across teams that, oh yeah, this is a thing, a way we think about projects. So I was wondering how, to actually affect these learnings across the teams, who does that? How does that happen?
So UX can be a good common language, because everybody ultimately wants the product to work with users, and I think usually everybody gets this. Usually everybody gets the sort of business case about reducing risk. I think a really important thing to bear in mind is that project managers may well have had their fingers burnt in the past. So they may well have had people saying, okay, we need to do a lot of research, we need to create personas, we need to do all these things, and maybe it's ended up wasting a lot of money in the past. So that can often be something that's happened, which is completely fair enough. So I think the message for UX designers who, of course, know about all these things comes back to human-centered design within the organization, speaking the right language, and being able to explain to maybe a skeptical project manager. If they're skeptical, then they should be. Because of the cargo cult user-centered design that often happens. And they say if you can't explain something in a way that a 5-year-old can understand, you probably don't understand it properly yourself. So that often, I think, when there is pushback, nobody's saying we want to take a big risk and we're happy to put something out there that users may well reject. So if they haven't understood the value for user-centered activities, that's because the purpose hasn't been explained clearly enough, or maybe the UX team's trying to do something that's too big for for the budget on that project, so it needs to be scaled down appropriately.
One thing that you said that really rang true for me was the idea of not allowing the user to become the designer. And working on a project where the user is also the one paying the contract. And sometimes they want to get involved with the design, even in situations where they're kind of shooting themselves in the foot. Are there any good strategies to try and talk them down from those situations?
Well, you definitely want to encourage this enthusiasm that they've got. You don't want to say, no, you're not going to be allowed to be involved in the designers, which often happens. Often designers are very precious and they don't want anybody getting involved. And part of human-centered design is not being precious, not designing in silos, but taking on the expertise of customers. They often are going to have a lot of very valuable insights. But yeah, you don't want to have users actually designing it, and you don't want customers to actually do the design work. But it's about involving them quickly and at the right times. The other thing is the best practice is absolutely a big part of human-centered design. So following interaction design best practice, and if a user is suggesting something that is a bad way to design something, usually that's great. Usually there's a reason why they're asking for that. Mm-hmm. And so you can use that in terms of understanding what is the intent behind this request, and then proposing a design solution that is following best practice, and then testing that with them again. And if it's not what they want, there's likely to be a reason why it's not what they want, so then you need to propose another solution. But yeah, involving users in a way that uncovers what their intent is behind the design is how to involve users in the design stage.
So I used to work at kayak.com, and this information is years old because I left there in 2014, but at that time we would release like once a week, so we involved users sort of periodically. We'd bring in people who hadn't booked travel on kayak before or whatever, and we'd put them in a room, and then we'd all sit in a conference room listening to what they were saying and watching what they were doing with the app and see how confused they were and stuff. But we didn't use them as part of this weekly iteration. So how do you do that? When you've got an existing big website, it's got stuff that's going on, how do you do user-centered design on a regular basis?
Yeah, well, I suppose it doesn't. If weekly isn't appropriate, then weekly isn't appropriate. I think with kayak.com, that's an example of best practice. So they're definitely doing something right.
Yeah. And it was from the beginning, right?
But getting user feedback in the most appropriate way. So yeah, it doesn't need to be bringing people into a usability lab. You'd be getting a lot of analytics back from people using it, which is part of that's user-centered design. Also that's at a stage where the system is live, so then it becomes about continually monitoring and tracking use with users, which is another big part of it. I think we're out of time. Thank you, everybody.